The evening of the 12th of October settled gently over the village of St. Mary Mead like a soft woolen shawl. The air carried the faint, sweet smell of late roses and damp earth, and the church clock had just struck 7:30 when the quiet knock came at the vicarage door. Mrs. Price, the vicar's elderly housekeeper, was wiping her hands on her apron in the warm kitchen when she heard it. A small, polite rap. Nothing urgent, nothing alarming. She sighed, thinking it was probably young Tommy from the village shop with the evening paper that the vicar always forgot to collect. She shuffled down the dimly lit hallway, her slippers making soft scuffing sounds on the polished floorboards. When she opened the heavy oak door, a cool breeze slipped inside, carrying with it the delicate scent of gardenias, but there was no one there. Mrs. Price peered out into the gathering dusk, her eyes narrowing behind her spectacles. The gravel path lay empty under the pale glow of the porch light. No footsteps retreating, no figure disappearing into the shadows of the yew hedge. Only silence, broken by the distant hoot of an owl. She was about to close the door when something caught her eye. Lying on the top step, neat and solitary, was a single lady's glove. It was made of fine, pale grey kid leather, beautifully stitched with a small pearl button at the wrist. The sort of glove that spoke of money, of careful breeding, of evenings at the theatre or quiet dinners in London. Mrs. Price bent down with a little grunt and picked it up. It was still warm. A faint shiver ran through her, not from cold, but from something she could not quite name. She stood there for a moment, the glove resting in her palm like an unspoken question, the scent of gardenias clinging stubbornly to the air around her. "Bless my soul," she muttered, closing the door a little more firmly than usual. "Whoever left this has gone off in a terrible hurry." Inside the drawing room, the Reverend Leonard Clement was reading his sermon notes by the fire, his kind face creased in concentration. His wife, Griselda, a lively young woman with bright eyes and untidy dark curls, was curled up on the sofa with a novel, one foot tucked beneath her. "Someone at the door, Mrs. Price," Griselda called lazily, not looking up from her book. "No one, ma'am," the housekeeper replied, her voice unusually tight. She entered the room and held out the glove. Only this, left on the step, and the scent of gardenias. Strong it was, eyes like someone had just been standing there. Leonard looked up, blinking. A glove. How very odd. Griselda sat up at once, her novel forgotten. She took the glove from Mrs. Price and turned it over in her hands. "It's expensive. Look at the stitching, and it's still warm. Whoever was wearing it can't have gone far." Leonard frowned gently. Perhaps it was dropped by accident. Some lady passing by? At 7:30, on a chilly October evening, knocking at the vicarage and then vanishing? Griselda's voice held a note of excitement. "That doesn't sound like an accident, darling. It sounds like a mystery." Mrs. Price nodded vigorously, and the knock was so quiet, like they didn't really want to be heard, but they wanted us to find the glove, I'm sure of it. Leonard sighed. In the peaceful evening he had been looking forward to slipping away. "We should perhaps inform the police if someone is missing their glove, though it does seem rather trivial." "Trivial?" Griselda laughed, but there was affection in it. "You are hopeless, Leonard. This is St. Mary Mead. Nothing is ever trivial here." It was at that moment that the telephone in the hall gave a sudden, shrill ring. Mrs. Price went to answer it, and after a brief exchange, she returned, looking troubled. "It's Dr. Haydock, sir. He says there's been an accident at Old Hall. He sounded, well, not like himself. He asked if Miss Marple could come at once." Griselda's eyebrows shot up. "Miss Marple? At this hour?" Leonard rose slowly. "I suppose we had better go and see what this is about." "Mrs. Price, would you be kind enough to ring Miss Marple's cottage and ask if she can join us? Tell her it's rather urgent." 20 minutes later, a small party made its way through the quiet lanes toward Old Hall, the large, rather gloomy house that stood at the edge of the village. Miss Jane Marple walked between the vicar and his wife, her step surprisingly firm for a lady of her years. She wore a soft wool coat and a hat trimmed with violets, and in her gloved hands she carried the grey kid glove that had been left on the vicarage step. "I find it most interesting," she said in her gentle, precise voice. "A glove left behind, still warm, and the scent of gardenias. Gardenias are not common in October, are they? One would have to have them specially brought from a hothouse." Griselda glanced at her with admiration. "You notice everything, hard Miss Marple." "One does try to keep one's eyes open, my dear," Miss Marple replied modestly, a small smile touching her lips, but her blue eyes were sharp and thoughtful. They reached Old Hall just as the moon slipped out from behind a cloud, casting a silvery light over the ivy-covered walls. Dr. Haydock was waiting for them at the front door, his usually ruddy face pale and strained. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, his voice low. "I'm afraid it's rather bad. Colonel Bantry is dead." A shocked silence fell over the little group. "Dead?" Leonard repeated, stunned. "But I saw him only yesterday afternoon. He seemed perfectly well." "He was shot," Dr. Haydock said bluntly. "Through the heart, at close range. I was called here half an hour ago by the butler. Found him in his study. The window was open, and there were signs of a struggle. But the oddest thing," he hesitated, looking uncomfortable, "his wife, Mrs. Bantry, is missing, and so is their guest, a young woman named Miss Sylvia Lane." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly on the grey glove. "Missing?" she asked softly. "Vanished," Dr. Haydock confirmed. "Both of them. No note, no explanation. The maid says Mrs. Bantry was wearing a grey coat and gloves when she last saw her around 7 o'clock. And Miss Lane, well, she was known to wear gardenia perfume. Quite distinctive." Griselda caught her breath. "The glove. The gardenias." Miss Marple nodded, almost to herself. "Yes, my dear. It does seem rather suggestive, doesn't it?" They were led into the study, a comfortable masculine room lined with books and hunting trophies. Colonel Bantry lay slumped in his leather armchair, and a dark stain spreading across his evening shirt. His face, once stern and commanding, now wore an expression of mild surprise, as though death had caught him in the middle of a polite conversation. Miss Marple moved closer, studying the scene with quiet attention. She did not touch anything, but her eyes missed nothing. The overturned inkpot on the desk, the scattered papers, the faint smear of lipstick on the edge of a crystal glass. "Poor man," she murmured. "He always seemed so certain of everything. Life has a way of surprising us when we least expect it." Dr. Haydock cleared his throat. "The police have been called, of course. Inspector Slack will be here shortly. But I thought, well, Miss Marple, you have a way with these things. And Mrs. Bantry was your friend." Miss Marple looked up, her expression gentle but grave. "Miss Dolly Bantry is a dear friend, yes. She has a kind heart, though she can be rather impulsive at times. I cannot believe she would harm her husband. Not deliberately." "Yet she is missing," Leonard said quietly, "along with this Miss Lane." "And someone," Miss Marple added softly, "came to the vicarage at 7:30 and left a single glove behind, almost as if they wanted us to know they had been there, or perhaps wanted us to know they were leaving." She turned the grey glove over in her hands once more, her fingers tracing the delicate pearl button. "Someone left," she whispered, almost to herself. "But the question is, who? And why did they choose my dear vicar's doorstep to say goodbye?" Outside, the church clock began to strike 8. The sound rolled across the quiet village like a warning. Miss Marple lifted her eyes to the open window, where the night breeze still carried the faintest trace of gardenias. "Whatever happened here tonight," she said calmly, "began long before 7:30, and I fear it will not end quickly." She smiled then, a small, kind smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "But we shall see, shan't we? One step at a time, As my dear nephew Raymond always says, the smallest details often tell the largest stories. And with that, Miss Marple settled herself into a chair by the fire, the grey glove resting neatly in her lap, and waited for the police to arrive. Inspector Slack arrived at Old Hall with his usual brisk efficiency, his heavy boots echoing in the hallway like an unwelcome drum beat. He was a tall, rather irritable man who believed firmly in facts, fingerprints, and in the absolute superiority of police procedure over what he privately called old ladies' knitting circle theories. Yet even he paused for a moment when he saw Miss Marple sitting calmly by the fire, the grey glove still resting in her lap like a sleeping dove. "Miss Marple," he said, nodding curtly. "Didn't expect to find you here so quickly." "One does try to be of use where one can, Inspector," she replied gently, her voice carrying that soft, almost apologetic tone that always made Slack feel slightly defensive. He turned his attention to the body of Colonel Bantry. After a brief examination and a few sharp questions to Dr. Haydock, he straightened up, rubbing his chin. Shot at close range. No sign of the weapon yet. Window was open, suggests the killer may have escaped that way. But the struggle looks messy. Papers scattered, ink spilled. Not a clean job. He glanced at the crystal glass with the faint smear of lipstick. And it seems there was a woman here recently. Griselda, who had been standing quietly beside her husband, could not remain silent. "Inspector, there's something you should know. Earlier this evening, at exactly 7:30, someone knocked at the vicarage door. When Mrs. Price opened it, there was no one there, only this glove on the step." She gestured toward Miss Marple's lap, and the air was full of gardenia scent. Slack's eyebrows rose. "Gardenias? At this time of year?" "Quite so," Miss Marple said mildly. "Miss Sylvia Lane was known to wear that particular perfume. Rather strong and distinctive, I believe. And Mrs. Bantry's maid mentioned she was wearing grey gloves this evening." The inspector took the glove from Miss Marple and turning it over in his large hands. "Expensive. Monogrammed inside. Tiny initials S.L. Well, well. Sylvia Lane, the Colonel's house guest for the past 10 days. Leonard Clement shifted uncomfortably. "We don't wish to jump to conclusions, Inspector. Mrs. Bantry is a good woman, a bit high-spirited perhaps, but devoted to her husband in her own way." "Devoted enough to run off with a young lady who was staying under their roof?" Slack asked dryly. "Because that's what it looks like at first glance. Wife discovers husband's affair, confrontation in the study, things get heated, a shot is fired, perhaps in panic, and then both women disappear into the night." Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. "It is a very neat explanation, Inspector. Almost too neat. One wonders why the glove was left at the vicarage, rather than simply dropped here in the study. And why at precisely 7:30? The church clock is quite reliable, you know." Slack grunted. "People do strange things when they're frightened or guilty, Miss Marple. We'll search the grounds and the village. If they're hiding nearby, we'll find them." He began issuing orders to his constables, who had arrived moments earlier. Footsteps echoed through the old house as rooms were checked and servants questioned. The butler, an elderly man named Simmons, stood stiffly in the hallway, his face pale with shock. "I last saw the Colonel at 7:15, sir," he told Slack. "He was in the study with Miss Lane. They were arguing, not loudly but intensely. Mrs. Bantry had gone upstairs to change for dinner. When I returned at 7:40 with the sherry, the study door was closed. I knocked but received no answer. I assumed they had finished their discussion." "And Mrs. Bantry?" Miss Marple asked gently from her chair. "She came down around 7:25, ma'am. Looked rather upset. Said she was going for a short walk in the garden to clear her head. She took her grey coat and gloves. That was the last I saw of her." Griselda whispered to her husband, "Poor Dolly. She always did hate scenes. But to disappear like this—" Miss Marple's eyes had grown thoughtful. She rose quietly and moved to the open window of the study. The night air was cool against her face. Beyond the terrace, the garden stretched into darkness, its paths lined with yew hedges and rose beds that Colonel Bantry had tended with military precision. So she noticed something small and white caught on a thorn of the nearest rose bush. Stepping carefully onto the terrace, she retrieved it. It was a torn scrap of fine lace handkerchief, edged with delicate embroidery. The initials D.B. were just visible in one corner. "Dolly's," she murmured to herself. She always carried the prettiest things. Inspector Slack appeared beside her. "Found something?" "Only a handkerchief, Inspector. It appears Mrs. Bantry did indeed walk this way." Slack took it, his expression hardening. "Another clue pointing toward flight. We'll drag the lake tomorrow if necessary." Miss Marple did not reply immediately. Instead, she looked back toward the house, where lights now blazed in every window. Inside, she could see Dr. Heideck speaking quietly with Leonard and Griselda. The young couple looked worried, their faces close together in quiet conversation. Griselda's hand rested protectively on her husband's arm, a small gesture of comfort that spoke volumes about their marriage. Steady, affectionate, built on years of shared quiet joys and small worries. How different from the Bantrys, Miss Marple thought with a pang of sadness. Colonel Bantry had been a man of rigid habits and strong opinions, while Dolly had always seemed like a bright bird trapped in a rather dull cage. She had laughed too loudly at parties and cried too easily in private. And now, a soft footstep behind her made Miss Marple turn. It was the maid, a young woman named Rose, her eyes red from crying. "Begging your pardon, miss," Rose whispered, "but I thought you should know. Miss Lane, she wasn't just a guest. The Colonel had been, well, they're paying her a lot of attention these past weeks." Mrs. Bantry knew. She tried to hide it, but I saw her face when they were together. Hurt she was. Real hurt. Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the girl's arm. "Thank you, my dear. It is always painful when trust is broken, isn't it? Especially in one's own home." Rose nodded, swallowing hard. "Mrs. Bantry was kind to me. Always remembered my mother's birthday. I can't believe she'd do anything violent." "Neither can I," Miss Marple said softly. "But people are capable of surprising things when their hearts are wounded. The question is whether this wound was deep enough to cause murder, or whether someone else used it as a convenient cover." Inside, Inspector Slack was questioning Simmons again, his voice growing sharper. Did the Colonel have any enemies? Not anyone who might have wanted him dead? The butler hesitated. "Not enemies exactly, sir. But the Colonel was a man who spoke his mind. There was that business with young Mr. Arthur Bantry, his nephew. They quarreled last month over money. The Colonel cut him off, said he was irresponsible. Mr. Arthur was very angry, said some harsh things. Slack made a note. We'll speak to him tomorrow." Miss Marple rejoined the others in the drawing room. Griselda poured her a cup of tea that someone had thoughtfully prepared. The warmth of the cup felt comforting against Miss Marple's fingers. "You look tired, Miss Marple," Griselda said kindly. "This must be upsetting for you. Dolly was your friend." "She still is, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady but carrying a quiet sorrow. "No, friendship does not vanish because of unfortunate circumstances. One must hold on to what one knows to be true in one's heart, even when the evidence seems to point elsewhere." Leonard nodded thoughtfully. "It's the human side that troubles me most. Colonel Bantry was not an easy man, but he loved this village. He supported the cricket club, the church roof fund. He had his faults, but he tried to do right. And now he lies dead in his own study," Miss Marple said quietly. "With his wife and his young guest both missing, a glove left at the vicarage, a handkerchief caught on a rose thorn, gardenias in the October air. So many small pieces, yet they do not quite fit together neatly." She sipped her tea, her mind working busily behind her calm, elderly face. Oh, there was something about the timing, the precise 7:30, that nagged at her. It felt deliberate, almost theatrical, as though someone had wanted the village to notice, to wonder, to begin asking questions. Outside, the search continued. Constables moved through the garden with lanterns, their lights bobbing like fireflies. The night had grown colder, and the scent of gardenias had finally faded, replaced by the sharper smell of damp leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. Inspector Slack returned, looking dissatisfied. "No sign of the women yet. We've checked the grounds and the immediate lanes. Tomorrow we'll widen the search. In the meantime, I suggest everyone gets some rest. There's nothing more to be done tonight." But as the little group prepared to leave Old Hall, Miss Marple lingered for a moment in the hallway. She looked up at the grand staircase where Dolly Bantry had descended earlier that evening, her face troubled. In her mind's eye, she could almost see her friend, elegant, impulsive Dolly, walking down those stairs, pulling on her grey gloves, stepping out into the garden with a heavy heart. What had she been thinking in those final moments? Anger, fear, despair? Or had she been running toward something, or away from someone? Miss Marple slipped the torn lace handkerchief into her coat pocket next to the grey glove that Inspector Slack had reluctantly returned to her for safe keeping. "Sleep well, my dear Dolly," she whispered to the empty staircase. "Wherever you are tonight, we shall find the truth, one small thread at a time." As she stepped out into the cool night with the Clements, the church clock began to strike 9, though each chime seemed heavier than the last, marking the passage of time since that quiet knock at 7:30. Someone had left, but Miss Marple was quite certain that the real story, the one that mattered, was only just beginning to unfold. The next morning dawned grey and misty over St. Mary Mead, as though the village itself were mourning the loss of one of its more prominent residents. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and sat by the window of her cosy sitting room with a cup of weak tea and a slice of buttered toast. The grey kid glove and the torn lace handkerchief lay on the small table beside her, silent witnesses to the previous night's tragedy. She had slept little. Her mind kept returning to the precise moment of 7:30. The quiet knock, the empty doorstep, the lingering perfume. It felt staged, and almost like a carefully arranged scene in one of those modern plays Griselda sometimes dragged Leonard to see in London. But why, and for whose benefit? A soft tap at the door announced her maid, Cherry, who entered with the Morning Post and a worried expression. "Terrible news about the Colonel, ma'am. The whole village is buzzing. They say Mrs. Bantry has run off with that young Miss Lane after shooting him in a fit of jealousy. Mrs. Price was at the baker's early, and said the inspector was already back at Old Hall with more men." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "People do love to talk, Cherry, but talk is not always truth. Thank you, dear. I shall take my usual walk after breakfast." Her usual walk that morning led her quite naturally toward Old Hall once more. The mist clung to the hedges, softening the outlines of the great house and making the garden look strangely ethereal. As she approached the front gates, she met Dr. Haydock coming down the drive, his medical bag in hand and his face lined with fatigue. "Miss Marple," he greeted her warmly, though his eyes were shadowed. "You're out early. Couldn't sleep either." "One's mind does tend to wander at night when unpleasant things have happened," she replied. "How is the household this morning?" "Strained. The servants are jumpy. Simmons looks 10 years older, and young Rose keeps bursting into tears. I gave her a mild sedative. As for the search, nothing yet. No sign of Dolly or the girl. Inspector Slack is convinced they've made for London or perhaps caught a train to the coast." Miss Marple walked beside him, her steps measured. "And you, Doctor? What do you think?" Haydock rubbed the back of his neck. "I've known Dolly Bantry for 20 years. She has a temper, yes, and she's impulsive. But she's not a murderer, not in cold blood. If she fired that shot, It would have been in the heat of the moment, and then she'd have collapsed in hysterics, not vanished neatly into the night. The whole thing feels wrong, too tidy. Exactly, Miss Marple murmured. Too tidy, like a story someone wanted us to believe. They reached the house just as Inspector Slack emerged from the study, looking even more irritable than usual. He carried a small bundle of letters tied with ribbon. "Morning, Miss Marple. Still playing detective?" he said, though there was less bite in his voice than usual. Perhaps the long night had worn him down. "We found these in Mrs. Bantry's dressing table. Love letters, from the Colonel to Sylvia Lane. Started about 6 weeks ago. He was quite taken with her, promised her all sorts of things. The wife must have found them." Miss Marple accepted the letters when he offered them, scanning a few lines with her sharp eyes. The Colonel's handwriting was bold and angular, full of possessive affection. "My dearest Sylvia, you have brought light into this dull life of mine." She handed them back without comment. "Painful reading for any wife," she said quietly. "But pain does not always lead to violence, Inspector. Sometimes it leads to quiet suffering or to flight." Slack grunted. "We're bringing in the nephew, Arthur Bantry, this morning. He had a row with the Colonel recently. Money troubles. Might have a motive." At that moment, a young man came cycling up the drive at some speed. He was in his late 20s, fair-haired and rather handsome in a careless way, though his clothes looked rumpled and his face was pale with shock. Arthur Bantry dismounted and leaned his bicycle against the wall. "I came as soon as I heard," he said breathlessly. "Is it true? Uncle Edward, dead?" Slack nodded grimly. "Shot last night. Your aunt and Miss Lane are missing. We'd like a word with you, Mr. Bantry." Arthur ran a hand through his hair. "Of course, anything, but Aunt Dolly, she wouldn't... she adored Uncle Edward even when he was being difficult." Miss Marple watched the young man closely. There was genuine distress in his eyes, but also something else. Nervousness, perhaps, or guilt. She had seen that look before in villagers who had small secrets they hoped would stay buried. "So, perhaps we could all go inside," she suggested gently. "A cup of tea might help steady the nerves." In the drawing room, with fresh tea brought by a trembling Rose, the conversation turned heavier. Arthur sat on the edge of a chair, twisting his hands. "I saw Uncle Edward 2 weeks ago," he admitted. "We argued about money. I'd got into a bit of debt, gambling, stupid really. He called me worthless, said he was changing his will. I was angry, said things I shouldn't have, but I didn't kill him, I swear it." Inspector Slack leaned forward. "Where were you last night between 7 and 8? "At the Blue Boar in the next village having a drink with some friends. The landlord knows me. We left around 9, I can prove it." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her expression serene. "And Miss Sylvia Lane, as did you know her well?" Arthur flushed slightly. "I met her once or twice when I visited. Pretty girl, lively. Uncle seemed smitten. Aunt Dolly tried to laugh it off, but I could see it hurt her. She confided in me a little. Said she felt old and unwanted." Griselda and Leonard arrived shortly after, having walked over from the vicarage. Griselda's eyes were bright with concern, and she went straight to Miss Marple. "Any news? The village is full of the most dreadful rumors. Someone even suggested Dolly and Sylvia had planned the whole thing together and fled to Paris." Miss Marple shook her head. "Rumors grow quickly, my dear, like bindweed in a garden. We must pull them out before they choke the truth." She turned to Inspector Slack. "If I may make a small suggestion, Inspector." And the glove left at the vicarage had the initials S.L. Yet it was still warm when Mrs. Price found it. If Sylvia Lane left it there at 7:30, why did she not simply drop it in the study or on the path? And the gardenia scent. Very strong, almost as if someone wanted it noticed. Slack frowned. "You think it was planted?" "I think someone is trying to tell us a story," Miss Marple said softly. "A story of jealousy, flight, and convenient disappearance. But real life is rarely so straightforward. People have emotions that don't fit neatly into such tales. Dolly Bantry loved her garden, her home, her friends. She was not the sort to vanish without a word, unless she was terribly frightened, or protecting someone. Arthur looked up sharply. Protecting someone? Who? Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked, "Did your uncle have any other visitors yesterday evening? Anyone unexpected?" Simmons, who had been hovering near the door, cleared his throat. "There was a telephone call around 6:30, sir. A woman's voice. She asked for the colonel. He took it in the study, sounded agitated afterward." Slack made a note. "We'll check the exchange." The morning wore on with more questions, more searches of the grounds. Miss Marple wandered into the garden alone for a while, her keen eyes noting the disturbed gravel on one of the side paths and a broken twig on a laurel bush. Small things, easily overlooked. She found Griselda sitting on a stone bench near the rose garden, looking unusually subdued. "I keep thinking about Dolly," Griselda said, her voice catching. "She was always so full of life, laughing at Leonard's sermons. Bringing me flowers when I was ill last winter. If she's out there somewhere, frightened or hurt," she wiped her eyes quickly. "It's the not knowing that's hardest." Miss Marple sat beside her and patted her hand. "We feel these things deeply because we care, my dear. That is the human part of it. Murder is not just a puzzle for the police. It tears at the hearts of those left behind. Dolly would not want us to despair. She would want us to be clever." Griselda managed a watery smile. "You always make it sound so simple, like untangling a ball of wool." "Sometimes it is," Miss Marple replied. "One pulls the right thread and the knots come undone, but first we must find the right thread." Later that afternoon, a constable came running from the direction of the lake at the bottom of the garden. His face was white. "Inspector, we found something in the water near the reeds." Everyone hurried down. Floating among the water lilies was a grey coat, Dolly Bantry's coat, sodden and heavy. One sleeve was torn and a button was missing. Slack stared at it grimly. "Looks like she tried to get rid of it, or someone did." Miss Marple stood very still, her face pale but composed. In her mind, a different picture was forming, not of flight or suicide, but of careful misdirection. The coat in the lake, the glove at the vicarage, the perfume in the air. It all pointed in one direction, almost too obviously. She turned to Inspector Slack. "I believe we should search the boathouse more carefully, and perhaps the old summer house at the far end of the garden, places where someone might hide, or where something might have been hidden." Slack looked skeptical but gave the order. Now, as the men moved off, Miss Marple remained by the lake, watching the ripples slowly settle. The water was dark and still now, reflecting the grey sky. "Someone left at 7:30, she whispered to the quiet garden. "But I am beginning to think it was not Dolly, nor Sylvia. Someone else walked away from this house that evening, carrying secrets heavier than any glove." She felt a small ache in her chest. Genuine sorrow for her old friend, mixed with the quiet determination that had solved so many puzzles before. Life in St. Mary Mead was rarely simple, but human hearts were even more complicated. Jealousy, love, fear, loyalty, they tangled together like the roots of the old yew trees. Miss Marple straightened her shoulders and started back toward the house. There was work to be done. Threads to pull. And somewhere, perhaps not far away, the truth was waiting to be uncovered, one careful, patient step at a time. The discovery of Dolly Bantry's grey coat floating in the lake sent a fresh wave of shock through Old Hall and the village beyond. By midday, the news had spread like wildfire through St. Mary Mead. Women gathered at the post office with baskets on their arms, speaking in hushed, excited tones. Men lingered outside the Blue Boar, shaking their heads and speculating whether the colonel's wife had taken her own life in a fit of remorse or had been silenced by her younger rival. Miss Marple, however, remained quietly unconvinced. She stood a little apart from the small crowd that had gathered near the lake, her hands folded over the handle of her umbrella. The mist had lifted, revealing a pale sun that did little to warm the autumn air. Inspector Slack was directing his men to drag the shallower parts of the lake with long poles, their faces grim. "No body yet," Slack muttered, coming to stand beside her. "But the coat is damning. Torn sleeve, missing button. Looks like a struggle." "Or someone wanted it to look like a struggle," Miss Marple said gently. "Tell me, Inspector, have you found the missing button?" Slack blinked. "Not yet." "Why?" "Because small things matter, my dear Inspector. A missing button might turn up in an unexpected place. And if it does, it could tell us a different story altogether." Before Slack could reply, a cry came from the direction of the old boathouse, a weathered wooden structure half hidden by willows at the lake's edge. Constable Higgs emerged, holding something small and metallic in his gloved hand. "Found this inside, sir. Tucked behind a loose board." It was a small pearl-handled revolver. 2 shots had been fired. Slack's face tightened with satisfaction. "The murder weapon, most likely. We'll check for prints, but I'd wager it belongs to the colonel. He kept several firearms." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she examined the revolver from a respectful distance. How very convenient. Left in the boathouse where it would eventually be found, almost as if someone wished to close the case neatly. Arthur Bantry, who had been hovering nearby, looked visibly shaken. "That's Uncle Edward's old pocket revolver. He showed it to me once. Said it was for protection against burglars, though we all knew he just liked having weapons around." Griselda, who had joined them with Leonard, shivered and drew her coat closer. "This is becoming horrible. First the glove, then the coat in the lake, now the gun. It feels as though we're being led by the hand through someone else's story." "Precisely, my dear," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. "And that is what troubles me most. Real tragedies are rarely so obligingly staged. They are messy, full of loose ends and human failings. This one has too many neat pointers, all pointing toward poor Dolly." Leonard cleared his throat. "Miss Marple is right. We must not rush to judgment. Dolly was impulsive, yes, but she had a good heart. She once sat up all night with me when I had influenza, reading to me from the Bible, even though she found it dreadfully dull." A faint smile touched Miss Marple's lips at the memory. She did have a way of showing kindness when one least expected it. "And I remember when my nephew Raymond was going through a difficult time with his writing. Dolly sent him a basket of fruit from her hothouse with a little note saying, 'For the starving artist.' It made him laugh for days. The human warmth of those recollections hung in the air, making the cold facts of the case feel even harsher." Inspector Slack, however, was a practical man. He ordered the revolver bagged and sent for testing, then turned his attention back to the search. "We'll continue dragging the lake," he said. "If Mrs. Bantry is in there, we'll find her. In the meantime, I want statements from everyone who was near the house last night." The afternoon brought more interviews in the drawing room. Rose, the maid, was questioned again. She twisted her apron in her hands, her young face blotchy from crying. "I heard raised voices in the study around 7 o'clock, she whispered. "The colonel and Miss Lane. She was crying, saying she couldn't go on like this. Then Mrs. Bantry came downstairs. I saw her through the banisters. She looked broken. She went straight out the side door into the garden without saying a word to anyone." Miss Marple leaned forward kindly. "And did you notice anything else, my dear? Any scent, perhaps?" Rose nodded. "Gardenias. Strong. Miss Lane always wore it. But after Mrs. Bantry left, I thought I smelled it in the hallway too. Funny that." Inspector Slack made a note, but Miss Marple's eyes brightened with quiet interest. The perfume again, appearing in 2 places at once. Later, when the room had cleared a little, Miss Marple found a moment alone with Dr. Haydock near the French windows. "Doctor, you examined the body closely. Was there anything unusual about the wound or the position of the colonel?" Haydock lowered his voice. "The shot was fired from about 3 feet away, straight into the heart. He was sitting down when it happened. No powder burns on his hands, so he didn't fire it himself. But here's the odd thing, the expression on his face. It wasn't fear or anger, it was surprise. Mild surprise, as though someone he trusted had suddenly turned on him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Trust betrayed is a terrible thing. It can make even strong men look childlike in death." She paused, then asked gently, "Did the colonel have any heart trouble? Any recent illness?" "Nothing serious. A touch of gout, but he was as robust as ever. Why do you ask?" "One never knows what small ailments might play a part," she replied vaguely. As evening approached, the search of the summer house yielded another discovery. A small overnight bag belonging to Sylvia Lane, hastily packed with a few clothes, some jewelry, and a bottle of gardenia perfume, nearly empty. The bag had been pushed under an old wicker chair. Slack rubbed his hands. "This seals it. The 2 women planned to leave together after the murder. The bag was meant to be collected later, but something went wrong." Miss Marple, who had insisted on accompanying the search, stood quietly in the musty summer house. She picked up the perfume bottle and sniffed it delicately. "Almost empty," she murmured. Yet the scent at the vicarage door was very strong. One does not use that much perfume for a quiet evening at home. She set the bottle down and looked around the small room. Her eyes fell on a faint smear of mud on the floor near the door, fresh mud with the clear imprint of a woman's shoe, size rather larger than Sylvia Lane's dainty feet. "Inspector," she said calmly, "I believe someone else was here last night. Someone who wore different shoes and perhaps carried the perfume bottle to create an impression." Slack looked skeptical but knelt to examine the print. Could be anyone. A servant, perhaps. "Servants do not usually hide overnight bags in summer houses," Miss Marple replied with a small smile. That evening, back at her own cottage, Miss Marple sat by her fire with a shawl around her shoulders. Cherry had brought her a light supper of scrambled eggs and toast, but she ate little. Instead, she turned over the grey glove in her hands, studying the stitching and the tiny pearl button. A soft knock sounded at the front door. It was Griselda, looking flushed from the walk and carrying a small posy of late chrysanthemums. "I thought you might like these," she said, handing them over. "Leonard is worried about you. He says you're carrying the weight of this on your own." Miss Marple accepted the flowers with genuine pleasure. "How kind. Your husband is a good man, Griselda. He sees the human side of things. That is rarer than one thinks." They sat together by the fire. Griselda's usual lively energy was subdued tonight. "I keep imagining Dolly out there somewhere," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Cold, frightened, perhaps regretting everything, or worse. Lying somewhere we haven't looked. It makes my heart ache." She was always so vibrant, even when the colonel was being his stiffest self. "She made our little village parties fun." Miss Marple reached over and squeezed her hand. "That is the hardest part of such mysteries, my dear, the waiting and the wondering about the people we care for. Emotions do not stop because a crime has been committed. They twist and turn inside us. Dolly loved her husband, I'm sure of that, but love can be wounded deeply. The question is whether that wound turned her into a killer or made her a victim." Griselda wiped her eyes. "You always sound so calm. How do you do it?" "One learns to look at the whole picture, not just the loudest colors," Miss Marple said. "And one remembers that behind every clue there is a person with hopes and fears. The glove at the vicarage was not left by accident. It was a message. But messages can lie." She paused, her blue eyes thoughtful. "Tomorrow, I think I shall pay a visit to young Arthur Bantry again. There is something in his manner that does not quite ring true. and then perhaps a word with the telephone exchange about that call at 6:30. Outside, the church clock struck 10. The sound rolled softly across the village, marking another hour since that fateful 7:30. Miss Marple stood at her window after Griselda had left, looking out into the quiet lane. A light mist had returned, softening the outlines of the cottages. "Someone left at 7:30, she whispered to the night. "But I am more convinced than ever that it was not the person we are meant to suspect. The real departure was quieter, more calculated, and the heart of this matter lies not in jealousy alone, but in something older and more carefully hidden." She felt a pang of genuine sadness. For Dolly, for the Colonel, for the young people whose lives had been caught in the tangle. Human lives were fragile things, easily broken by greed, passion, or fear. But Miss Marple had seen many such tangles before. With patience, kindness, and a sharp eye for the smallest details, the truth had a way of revealing itself. She turned from the window, the grey glove still in her hand. "Tomorrow," she said softly to herself, "we shall begin pulling the next thread." The following day brought a crisp clarity to St. Mary Mead that felt almost cruel after the misty uncertainty of the previous morning. Miss Marple set out after breakfast with her basket on her arm, as though she were merely going to the village shops for wool and a few stamps. In truth, her steps led her first to the small post office, where the telephone exchange operated from a back room tended by Miss Giddy, a talkative spinster with a sharp ear for gossip and a softer heart than she liked to admit. Miss Giddy greeted her warmly. "Oh, Miss Marple, such terrible business at Old Hall. Poor Mrs. Bantry. I always thought she had too much spirit for that stiff old Colonel. Have you heard the latest? They say the lake may still give up her body any day now." "One hears many things, my dear," Miss Marple replied gently, settling herself on the offered chair. "But I wondered if you could help me with a small matter of fact rather than rumour. There was a telephone call to Old Hall around 6:30 on the evening of the tragedy. A woman's voice, I believe. I don't suppose you recall who placed it." Miss Giddy's eyes brightened with the pleasure of being useful. She consulted her logbook, her finger tracing the entries. "Let me see. Yes, here it is. 6:28. Call from the public telephone box near the station. The caller asked for Colonel Bantry personally. I put it through." The voice was low, a bit husky. Could have been a younger woman trying to sound older, or an older woman trying to sound younger. Hard to tell. She didn't give a name. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "How very interesting. The station telephone box. One can be quite private there, especially in the early evening when the London train has already left." She thanked Miss Giddy and continued on her way, her mind turning over this new piece like a polished pebble, to a call from the station just before the fatal events. Someone had wanted to speak to the Colonel urgently, privately, and without being easily identified. Her next stop was the Blue Boar Inn, where Arthur Bantry had claimed to be drinking with friends on the night of the murder. The landlord, Mr. Blake, a stout, red-faced man with a fondness for Miss Marple's occasional gentle inquiries, confirmed the story readily enough. "Aye, young Mr. Arthur was here from about 7 until 9 or so," he said, polishing a glass. "Came in looking a bit down in the mouth. Had 3 pints with his pals from the motor garage. They were talking about the derby and such. He left around 9, steady enough on his feet." Miss Marple smiled. "Thank you, Mr. Blake. One does like to be certain about these things. The young people can be so careless with time." She did not mention that the walk from the Blue Boar to Old Hall could be managed in under 40 minutes if one took the footpath through the fields. Plenty of time for a quick visit and a return before anyone noticed an absence. From the inn, she made her way to the neat bachelor lodgings where Arthur Bantry was temporarily staying while his own small flat in London was being redecorated. He answered the door himself, looking surprised but not displeased to see her. "Miss Marple, come in, please. I'm afraid the place is rather untidy. Bachelor ways, you know." The sitting room was indeed cluttered with sporting magazines and empty cigarette packets, but there was a certain charm in its disorder. Miss Marple accepted a cup of rather weak coffee and sat in a worn armchair. "I won't keep you long, my dear boy," she said kindly. "But I have been thinking about your uncle. He was a man of strong principles, was he not? Sometimes those principles could make him rather harsh with those he cared about." Arthur sighed and ran a hand through his fair hair. "That's putting it mildly. Uncle Edward believed in duty, hard work, and keeping one's word. When I got into debt, he saw it as a personal failing, said I was spoiling the family name. He threatened to cut me out of the will entirely. I was angry, furious really, but I didn't wish him dead. He was family after all." There was real pain in his voice, the kind that comes from complicated love mixed with resentment. Miss Marple's heart softened a little. Young men often stumbled. It did not always make them murderers. "And Miss Sylvia Lane?" she asked gently. "What did you make of her?" Arthur hesitated, then gave a short, uncomfortable laugh. "She was beautiful, lively, and knew exactly how to make an older man feel young again. I think she enjoyed the attention and the gifts, but I doubt she was deeply in love with him. She once told me in confidence that she was tired of being the pretty ornament." I felt rather sorry for her, actually. Miss Marple studied him closely. "Did your aunt know about these conversations?" "Aunt Dolly? She suspected something was going on, but she never spoke of it openly to me. She just became quieter, more brittle. The last time I saw her, she looked fragile, like fine china that had been cracked but was still holding together." The image lingered with Miss Marple as she left Arthur's lodgings. Fragile, that was the word that kept returning. Dolly Bantry had always seemed vibrant on the surface, but beneath it there had been a vulnerability few people noticed. Her steps next took her back toward Old Hall, where Inspector Slack was once again in command of the study. He looked up as she entered, his expression a mixture of resignation and reluctant respect. "Miss Marple, I suppose you've come with another gentle suggestion." She smiled. "Only a small observation, Inspector. The public telephone call at 6:28 came from the station box, and the perfume bottle in the summer house was nearly empty, yet the scent at the vicarage was remarkably strong. One does wonder whether the gardenias were used liberally to create an impression rather than worn naturally." Slack leaned back in the colonel's chair. You're suggesting someone deliberately planted evidence to make it look like Sylvia Lane was at the vicarage. Or someone wanted us to believe that both women left together in a dramatic fashion," Miss Marple replied. "The glove with SL initials, the strong perfume, the coat in the lake, the gun in the boathouse. It is all rather theatrical, is it not? Like a stage play designed to distract the audience from the real action happening off stage." The inspector rubbed his chin. "Possible. But who would go to such lengths, and why leave the glove at the vicarage of all places?" "Because the vicarage is the heart of the village," Miss Marple said softly. "What happens there becomes known to everyone. A quiet knock at 7:30 ensures that the story begins to spread immediately. Someone wanted the village talking about a mysterious departure, rather than looking too closely at what really happened inside Old Hall." At that moment, Dr. Haydock arrived with the preliminary autopsy report. He looked tired but determined. "Death was instantaneous," he told them. "The bullet entered the heart cleanly. No other injuries except some minor bruising on the left wrist, perhaps from the struggle over the desk. Interesting thing, though. There were traces of gardenia perfume on the colonel's shirt collar. Quite fresh." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "On the collar, not on the hands or the face." "Exactly. As though someone had leaned close to him, perhaps in an embrace or an intimate conversation, shortly before the shot was fired." A small silence fell. Griselda and Leonard, who had slipped in quietly, exchanged worried glances. So Griselda's hand found her husband's, seeking comfort in the simple human gesture. That suggests the colonel was not arguing with Sylvia when he died. Miss Marple said thoughtfully. He may have been saying goodbye, or making a promise, or perhaps being comforted by someone he trusted. Slack stood up abruptly. This is all very well, but we still have no sign of the two women. If they're alive, they're hiding. If they're dead, the lake or the woods will eventually tell us. Miss Marple rose as well. I think, Inspector, we should consider the possibility that only one woman left Old Hall that evening, and that the other never had the chance to leave at all. Her words hung in the air like the last notes of a church bell. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual seat in the vicarage drawing-room for tea with the Clements. Soon the fire crackled cheerfully, but the atmosphere was subdued. Griselda poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. I can't stop thinking about the human cost of all this, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Colonel Bantry was difficult, but he built this village cricket pavilion with his own money. Dolly always remembered everyone's birthdays. And Sylvia, she was so young, so full of life. Whatever happened, 3 lives have been shattered, and we sit here piecing together clues while they suffer. Leonard placed a gentle hand on his wife's shoulder. That is why Miss Marple's way is important, my dear. She never forgets that behind every mystery, there are real people with real hearts. Miss Marple accepted her cup with a grateful nod. You are both kind. It is easy to become caught up in the puzzle and forget the pain. But pain is the truest clue of all. When someone is deeply hurt, they behave in ways that are not logical. They leave traces of their feelings scattered about, like a glove on a doorstep or a scent that lingers too strongly. She set her cup down and looked at her friends with quiet determination. Tomorrow I believe we should look more carefully at the Colonel's papers. There may be a will or letters or some financial matter that someone wished to keep hidden. And I think a quiet word with the gardener about any unusual activity near the summer house would not go amiss. As the light began to fade, Miss Marple walked home slowly, the autumn leaves crunching under her feet. The church clock struck 6, reminding her once again how much time had passed since that fateful 7:30. She felt a deep, genuine sorrow for the tangled lives at Old Hall. Jealousy, love, money, fear. They had woven a web that had trapped more than one innocent person. But somewhere in that web there was a loose thread, a small inconsistency born of human error or human emotion. Miss Marple tightened her shawl against the evening chill. One more thread, she murmured. And then, perhaps, the pattern will begin to show itself clearly. The village lay quiet around her, but she knew that in the shadows of Old Hall the truth was still waiting, patient, hidden, and far more complicated than any simple tale of jealousy and flight. The morning of the 3rd day after the tragedy at Old Hall brought a gentle rain to St. Mary Mead, the kind that pattered softly on window panes and made the gardens smell of wet earth and fallen leaves. Now Miss Marple stood at her cottage door for a moment, breathing in the damp air before opening her umbrella and setting off toward Old Hall once more. She carried with her a small packet of seed cakes that Cherry had baked, a humble offering for the grieving household. Inside the great house, the atmosphere had grown heavier. The servants moved about their duties with subdued voices and red-rimmed eyes. Simmons, the butler, greeted Miss Marple with a weary bow and showed her into the morning room where Inspector Slack was already poring over a stack of papers from the Colonel's desk. More financial documents, Slack said without preamble, gesturing to the piles. The Colonel was wealthier than he let on. Investments in railways, some property in London, and a rather substantial sum in government bonds. And his will, dated 6 months ago, leaves the bulk of the estate to Mrs. Bantry, with a generous provision for his nephew Arthur and a small legacy for the village cricket club. Miss Marple accepted a chair and unfolded her hands neatly in her lap. And any recent changes to the will, Inspector? None that we've found yet. But there are letters here suggesting he was considering it. A draft note to his solicitor mentioning certain disappointments in the younger generation and a desire to secure the future for someone who has brought unexpected happiness. The words hung between them. Slack pushed a sheet across the desk. Miss Marple read it carefully, her sharp eyes noting the bold, angry strokes of the Colonel's pen. "Unexpected happiness," she murmured, a phrase that could mean many things. Love, perhaps, or relief from loneliness. So the Colonel was not a demonstrative man, but even the sternest hearts can soften when someone listens to them with kindness. Dr. Haydock joined them shortly after, shaking rain from his coat. He looked more troubled than usual. "I've been thinking about that perfume on the collar," he said, accepting a cup of tea from Rose. It was concentrated, as though the wearer had pressed quite close. An embrace, a whispered conversation, or someone leaning over him as he sat at the desk. The angle of the wound suggests the shooter was standing slightly to his left. Miss Marple nodded slowly. Standing to the left. Interesting. The Colonel was right-handed, I believe. If he had been facing someone in conversation, the natural position would place the visitor on his right. She turned to the window, watching the rain trace patterns down the glass. One pictures the scene, the Colonel in his chair, perhaps surprised by a visitor he trusted. A few quiet words. Then the shot, quick, clean, and final. No cry, no long struggle, only surprise on his face. Griselda arrived soon after, her dark curls damp from the rain and her cheeks flushed from the walk. She carried a small bunch of dahlias from her own garden, a bright splash of color in the somber room. "For the house," she explained, handing them to Rose. "I thought something living might help a little." Her voice caught as she looked around. "It feels so empty without Dolly's laugh echoing down the stairs. She used to tease me about my terrible flower arrangements, but she always made them look better just by smiling at them." Miss Marple reached out and patted Griselda's arm with genuine affection. "You have a kind heart, my dear. That is worth more than all the perfect bouquets in the world." Dolly would have appreciated the thought. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the emotional undercurrent. "Sentiment is all very well, but we need facts. We've searched the summer house again and found nothing new. The gardener, old Jenkins, swears no one unusual was near the lake that evening. But he did mention that the Colonel had been arguing with someone on the telephone earlier in the day, loudly, about money and ingratitude." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "The telephone call, from the station box at 6:28. Perhaps the earlier argument was with the same person." She asked to see the Colonel's private diary, a small leather-bound volume kept in the top drawer of his desk. Slack handed it over reluctantly, but Miss Marple turned the pages with care, her finger tracing the neat military-style entries. October 11th. "Sylvia coming for dinner. Must speak to D about future arrangements." October 12th. A causing more trouble. "Will not tolerate weakness. SL understands duty better than blood." "SL," Miss Marple said softly. Sylvia Lane again. "But the tone is different here. Understands duty." One wonders what duty the Colonel had in mind for a young woman who was, after all, only a guest. Arthur Bantry entered the room at that moment, shaking rain from his coat. He looked tired and rather disheveled, as though he had slept little. "I've been to see the solicitor," he announced. "Uncle Edward did discuss changing the will. He wanted to leave a larger sum to Sylvia Lane, enough for her to live independently. Nick said she had shown him what real companionship meant." Aunt Dolly knew about the discussion. She came to see me the day before yesterday, asking if I thought she should confront him. Miss Marple studied the young man's face. There was genuine sorrow there, mixed with guilt and something else. Fear, perhaps. "And what did you advise your aunt, my dear?" she asked gently. Arthur looked down at his hands. "I told her to wait, that Uncle Edward was stubborn but not cruel, that things might settle. I wish now I had told her to leave him, to come away with me for a while. She seemed so lost that day." The confession carried real emotion. Griselda's eyes filled with tears, and she turned away to hide them. Leonard, who had slipped in quietly behind his wife, placed a comforting arm around her shoulders. In that small gesture, Miss Marple saw the quiet strength of their marriage, the kind of steady love that the Bantrys had perhaps once shared, but had slowly eroded under the weight of routine and disappointment. Inspector Slack broke the silence. So Mrs. Bantry had motive, opportunity, and now we know she was emotionally distressed. The glove with Sylvia's initials at the vicarage, the perfume, the coat in the lake. It all fits a picture of two women fleeing after a crime of passion. Miss Marple folded the diary and set it aside. It fits too neatly, Inspector, like a jigsaw puzzle where someone has forced the pieces together. Real human beings do not behave with such perfect symmetry when their hearts are breaking. They make mistakes. They leave traces that do not match the story they are trying to tell. She rose and moved to the French windows, then looking out at the rain-soaked garden. The yew hedges glistened darkly, and the rose beds, so carefully tended by the colonel, were bowed under the weight of water. "Suppose," she said quietly, "that the person who knocked at the vicarage at 7:30 was not Sylvia Lane, but someone wearing her glove and carrying her perfume. Someone who wanted the village to believe that both women had left together. Someone who needed time to arrange other matters." Slack frowned. "Who, then? And where is Sylvia Lane now?" Miss Marple did not answer directly. Instead, she asked Rose, who was clearing the tea things, a gentle question. "My dear, when you saw Mrs. Bantry going out into the garden that evening, did she seem hurried? Or was she walking slowly as though thinking deeply?" Rose thought for a moment. "Slowly, ma'am, and almost like she was reluctant to go back inside. She paused by the rose bed and touched one of the flowers, even though it was getting dark. A small, sad smile touched Miss Marple's lips. Dolly always loved her roses. She said they reminded her of happier times." Later that afternoon, when the rain had eased, Miss Marple walked with Dr. Haydock along the gravel path toward the lake. The grey coat had been retrieved and now lay drying in the boathouse, a forlorn reminder of its owner. "Haydock," she said quietly, "you have known Dolly longer than most. In your medical opinion, was she capable of shooting her husband at close range and then calmly arranging all these clues?" The doctor sighed deeply. Capable in a moment of rage? Perhaps. But the cool planning afterward? No. Dolly was impulsive. She would have stayed with the body, weeping, or run screaming for help, not staged a disappearance worthy of a detective novel. Miss Marple nodded. Exactly. Which suggests the staging was done by someone colder, more calculating. Someone who understood how village gossip works and how a single glove on a vicarage step could set tongues wagging for days. They reached the summer house. Miss Marple stepped inside and looked again at the faint, muddy footprint near the door. Larger than Sylvia's, smaller than a man's. A woman's shoe, but not a dainty one. "Someone practical," she murmured. "Someone used to walking in the garden." That evening, back at the vicarage for a simple supper, Miss Marple shared her growing uneasiness with Leonard and Griselda. The fire crackled warmly, but the mood was somber. "I feel for all of them," Griselda said, pushing her plate aside. "And even Sylvia. She was young and perhaps foolish, but she didn't deserve to be caught in this web. And poor Arthur. He carries guilt like a heavy coat. You can see it in his eyes every time Dolly's name is mentioned." Leonard nodded. "Human frailty is what makes these cases so tragic. We want simple villains and heroes, but life gives us complicated, hurting people instead." Miss Marple looked into the flames, her face gentle but her mind sharp. Yes, and the person who left at 7:30 understood that very well. They used our natural sympathy and our love of a dramatic story to hide something much quieter, a betrayal that had been brewing for months, perhaps years. She set down her knitting, the grey glove still resting on the table beside her like a silent accusation. "Tomorrow," she said softly. "But I think we must look at the colonel's safe. And I believe we should ask Arthur Bantry one more question, about a certain letter he received from his aunt 2 days before the murder. Outside, the rain had stopped. The church clock struck 8, its chimes clear and steady in the damp air. Miss Marple felt the weight of sorrow in her chest for a marriage that had quietly died long before the shot was fired, for a young woman who might never be found, and for a village that would never quite be the same. But beneath the sorrow lay quiet resolve. The threads were beginning to pull apart. The pattern was emerging, not in bright dramatic colors, but in the subtle shades of human emotion, jealousy, loneliness, greed, and the desperate need to protect a secret. Someone had left at 7:30, and Miss Marple was determined to discover exactly who and what they had left behind. The rain had cleared by the following morning, leaving St. Mary Mead washed clean and sparkling under a pale blue sky. Miss Marple walked the familiar lane to Old Hall with a quiet purpose, her basket now containing a small pot of homemade damson jam and a carefully folded letter she'd received from Griselda early that morning. The village seemed subdued. Even the birds sang more softly, as though respecting the shadow that still hung over the great house. Inspector Slack met her at the door, his usual briskness tempered by evident frustration. No body in the lake, no fresh leads on the women, and the chief constable is pressing for an arrest. The evidence still points squarely at Mrs. Bantry and Miss Lane. I'm beginning to think we may never find them. Miss Marple offered him a gentle smile. Patience is a difficult virtue, Inspector, especially when one is dealing with human hearts. May I see the colonel's safe? I believe there may be something inside that has been overlooked. Slack hesitated, then shrugged. Very well. The key was in his desk drawer. We've been through it once, but you're welcome to look. The safe was a sturdy, old-fashioned affair, hidden behind a panel in the study wall. When opened, it revealed neat stacks of documents, a few bundles of banknotes, and a small leather box containing jewelry, pearls and a sapphire brooch that had belonged to Dolly's mother. At the back lay a single envelope, unsealed, addressed in the colonel's firm hand, to my dear Sylvia. Miss Marple lifted it carefully, and inside was a short letter and a folded legal document. My dearest Sylvia, the colonel had written, I have decided. The new will shall be signed tomorrow. You have shown me what true affection means in these later years. The provision I am making for you will ensure your future, free from worry. Dolly will understand in time. She has her own comforts. Edward. Attached was a codicil to the will, dated the day before the murder, leaving Sylvia Lane the sum of £15,000 and a small cottage on the edge of the estate. Inspector Slack whistled softly. That's a motive if ever I saw one. If Mrs. Bantry found this, she may have, Miss Marple said quietly. But would she have killed her husband over it? Or would she have confronted him as any wounded wife might? Because the human heart in pain often chooses words before bullets. She turned the codicil over in her hands. The paper was crisp, the ink still fresh. Notice the date, Inspector, the 12th of October, the very day of the tragedy. This was written shortly before the fatal events. At that moment, Arthur Bantry entered the study, summoned by Slack. He looked drawn, his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. When he saw the letter and codicil, his face paled. Uncle Edward really did it, he whispered. He was going to cut me out almost entirely for her. I knew he was fond of Sylvia, but this is generous beyond reason. Miss Marple watched him closely. You received a letter from your aunt 2 days before the murder, did you not, my dear? Arthur started, then nodded slowly. Yes, Aunt Dolly wrote to me. She was distressed. Said she had found some papers and feared Uncle was planning to leave her with very little. She asked if I would stand by her if things became difficult. I replied that of course I would, that family should support family. His voice cracked slightly. I never imagined it would come to this. I should have come to see her that evening. If I had, perhaps none of this would have happened. There was raw regret in his words, the kind that comes from knowing one has failed someone dear. Griselda, who had arrived with Leonard a few minutes earlier, wiped her eyes discreetly. She'd always liked Dolly's impulsive warmth, and the thought of her friend facing such betrayal alone brought a fresh ache to her heart. Leonard placed a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder. "We cannot rewrite the past, Arthur, but we can seek the truth now. And Miss Marple believes there is more to this than a simple crime of passion." Miss Marple nodded. "Indeed. Let us consider the timing again. The telephone call at 6:28 from the station box. The argument in the study around 7. Mrs. Bantry leaving for the garden at 7:25. The quiet knock at the vicarage at precisely 7:30. Then silence. She paused, her blue eyes thoughtful. The glove left behind was Sylvia's. The perfume was strong, too strong for normal wear on a quiet evening. The coat found in the lake belonged to Dolly, yet the footprint in the summer house suggested a different shoe size. These details do not fit comfortably together. Slack crossed his arms. "You're still suggesting someone staged the whole thing?" "Not the whole thing," Miss Marple corrected gently. "The murder was real. The Colonel is truly dead. But the disappearance, that may have been arranged with great care by someone who needed time and a convincing story to hide behind." She turned to Arthur. "Tell me, my dear, did your aunt ever mention anyone else who might have had reason to dislike your uncle? Someone from his past, perhaps?" Arthur frowned, thinking. "There was an old army friend, Major Whitby. They quarreled years ago over some investment that went wrong. Uncle blamed Whitby for losing a lot of money, but that was ancient history. Whitby lives in Devon now, I believe." Miss Marple made a mental note. Small threads, easily dismissed, sometimes proved important. Later that afternoon, the little group moved to the garden. The sun had broken through, warming the wet paths. Miss Marple walked slowly beside the rose beds, her sharp eyes scanning the ground. Near the place where Dolly's handkerchief had been caught on the thorn, she paused and knelt carefully, despite her age. There, half hidden by a fallen leaf, lay a small pearl button, the exact match to the one missing from the grey glove left at the vicarage. She picked it up with her handkerchief and held it out to Inspector Slack. "Here is your missing button, Inspector. Not in the lake, not in the summer house, but here in the rose garden, where Dolly was seen touching the flowers before she supposedly vanished." Slack stared at it. "How did it get here if the glove was left at the vicarage?" "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone carried the glove to the vicarage, deliberately leaving it on the step. But the button came loose earlier, or perhaps during a brief struggle or when the glove was removed in haste. The person who left the glove was not Sylvia Lane. It was someone who wanted us to believe Sylvia had been here, and that both women had fled together." Griselda caught her breath. "Then where is Sylvia? And where is poor Dolly?" Miss Marple's expression grew grave, filled with genuine sorrow. "I fear Sylvia Lane may never have left Old Hall alive that evening. And Dolly, she may have seen something she was never meant to see. Or perhaps she was used as part of the plan, her distress providing the perfect cover." The words settled heavily over the group. Rose, who had been bringing fresh tea to the terrace, overheard and burst into quiet tears. "Mrs. Bantry was always kind to me," she sobbed. "She didn't deserve this. None of them did." "Doctor." Haydock placed a fatherly arm around the girl's shoulders. There, Rose. Grief is natural. We all feel it. The Colonel was a difficult man, but he was part of this village. His death has left a wound that will take time to heal." Miss Marple felt the weight of those emotions in her own chest, a deep, quiet sadness for lives disrupted, for trust shattered, and for the loneliness that had driven the Colonel to seek affection outside his marriage. She had seen too many such tragedies in her long life. Human beings were capable of great kindness and great cruelty, often in the same heart. That evening, back at her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting while Cherry served a simple supper. The grey glove lay on the table, now with its matching pearl button beside it. "The pattern is becoming clearer," she murmured to herself. To someone cold enough to plan, yet close enough to the colonel to lean over him and fire the shot without raising alarm. Someone who knew the house well. Someone who understood how a single dramatic gesture at 7:30 would set the entire village talking in the wrong direction. She thought of Dolly's kind heart, of Sylvia's youthful beauty, of Arthur's tangled guilt, and of the colonel's rigid pride. All of them caught in a web spun from greed, jealousy, and the desperate desire to protect a secret. A soft knock sounded at the door. It was Leonard Clement, his kind face etched with worry. "Miss Marple, I hope I'm not disturbing you. Griselda is beside herself with worry for Dolly. She keeps saying that if we don't find her soon, it will be too late." Miss Marple invited him in and poured him a cup of tea. "Your wife has a tender heart, Leonard. That is one of her greatest strengths. Tell her that we are close now. The threads are pulling tight. Tomorrow, I believe we must speak again with Major Whitby, if he can be reached by telephone, and search one more place, the old ice house behind the stables. It has been locked for years, but perhaps someone found a way in." Leonard nodded, gratitude in his eyes. "You give us hope when everything feels dark." "Thank you." After he left, Miss Marple stood at her window, looking out at the quiet village street. The church clock struck 9, each chime a reminder of how many hours had slipped away since that fateful knock at 7:30. She felt a profound compassion for all involved. No one in this sad affair was entirely innocent or entirely wicked, only human, and with all the messy emotions that entailed. Love turned sour, money tempting the weak, fear driving desperate actions. But justice, Miss Marple believed, required truth, no matter how painful. She picked up the grey glove and the pearl button, holding them to the light. "Almost there," she whispered. "One more day, and the person who left so quietly that evening will have to answer for what they took with them." The night settled gently over St. Mary Mead, but in Miss Marple's quiet cottage, the final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, with all the gentle sorrow and sharp insight that only a lifetime of observing human nature could provide. The final morning dawned bright and cold, with a sharp wind sweeping through St. Mary Mead that made the last remaining leaves dance across the lanes like restless spirits. Miss Marple rose early, dressed with her usual care in a warm wool coat and her favorite hat trimmed with violets, and made her way once more to Old Hall. She carried no basket this time, only the grey glove and its matching pearl button wrapped carefully in a clean handkerchief, and a quiet determination in her gentle blue eyes. Inspector Slack, Dr. Haydock, the Clements, and a pale but composed Arthur Bantry were already gathered in the drawing-room when she arrived. The atmosphere was tense, charged with the knowledge that something decisive was about to happen. Rose had laid out coffee and biscuits, but few had touched them. The weight of 3 days of uncertainty pressed heavily on every heart. Miss Marple took her seat by the fire and looked around at the little group with genuine kindness. "Thank you all for coming so early. This has been a sad and painful business for everyone. Colonel Bantry is gone and 2 women are missing. But the truth, when it comes, often brings a kind of peace, even if it is a sorrowful one." Slack cleared his throat. "You said you had something important to show us, Miss Marple, and you mentioned the old ice house." "Yes, Inspector." She unfolded the handkerchief and placed the grey glove and pearl button on the low table. "These 2 small things have been speaking to us all along. The glove left at the vicarage at precisely 7:30 carried Sylvia Lane's initials. The perfume of gardenias was strong, deliberately strong. The coat in the lake, the gun in the boathouse, the nearly empty perfume bottle in the summer house, all pointed neatly toward a story of jealousy, murder, and flight. But real life, as we know, "Ah is rarely so obliging." She paused, her voice soft but clear. "The button came loose in the rose garden, not at the vicarage. That told me the glove was carried there after the events in this house. Someone wanted the village to notice a dramatic departure. Someone wanted us looking outward, not inward." Arthur leaned forward, his hands clenched. "Then who? Who did this?" Miss Marple turned her gentle gaze on him. "You cared for your aunt very much, didn't you, my dear? Perhaps more than a nephew usually does. And you were angry with your uncle for his harshness, for threatening to cut you from the will, for choosing a younger woman over family loyalty." Arthur's face flushed. "I was angry, yes, but I didn't kill him. I was at the Blue Boar, until shortly after 7, Miss Marple interrupted kindly. "The walk through the fields to Old Hall takes less than 40 minutes. You could have arrived, spoken with your uncle, and returned before anyone missed you, but I do not believe you fired the shot." She looked at each face in turn. "No. The person who stood to the Colonel's left and fired that revolver was someone he trusted completely. Someone who could lean close enough for gardenia perfume to linger on his collar. Someone who knew the house, the garden, the hiding places." Griselda's hand flew to her mouth. "Not Dolly?" Miss Marple shook her head sadly. "No, my dear. Dolly Bantry did not kill her husband. She loved him even when he hurt her. But she was used, cruelly used, by someone who understood her pain and her impulsiveness." She rose slowly and moved to the window, looking out toward the garden and the distant stables. "Let us reconstruct that evening as it truly happened." Around 6:30, a telephone call from the station box. A woman's voice, low, husky, arranging a private meeting with the Colonel. At 7, an argument in the study. Not between the Colonel and Sylvia, but between the Colonel and the person who had come to see him about the new will and the codicil. Dr. Haydock frowned. But Sylvia Lane was already dead, Miss Marple said quietly, her voice filled with sorrow. Killed earlier that evening, perhaps in the summer house, where her overnight bag was later placed. The murderer needed her disappearance to look voluntary. The gardenia perfume was poured liberally to create the impression she had been everywhere. A shocked silence fell. Rose, standing by the door, gave a small cry and steadied herself against the wall. Miss Marple continued gently. Mrs. Bantry came downstairs around 7:25, distressed. She went into the garden to clear her head, as she often did when upset. She paused by the roses, her roses, and touched one last time. It was there that the murderer met her. Perhaps offered comfort, perhaps persuaded her to help hide what had happened, saying it was for the best that Sylvia had threatened them both. Dolly, in her pain and confusion, may have agreed to certain things, carrying the glove, perhaps even helping move something, but she was not the killer. Inspector Slack's face had grown hard. Then who was? Miss Marple turned back to the room. Her expression was kind, but her eyes were sharp with understanding. Someone who had been close to the Colonel for many years. Someone who knew his habits, his financial affairs, and his weaknesses. Someone who had once been more than a friend, perhaps a wartime companion who felt betrayed when investments failed and old promises were forgotten. She looked directly at the doorway where Simmons, the elderly butler, had appeared silently a moment earlier. Or perhaps not Simmons, she said softly, but someone who could move freely through this house without question. Someone whose shoe size matches the footprint in the summer house. Someone practical, used to garden work. At that moment, the side door from the terrace opened, and a tall, weather-beaten woman in a plain coat and sturdy walking shoes stepped into the room. It was Mrs. Martha Whitby, widow of Major Whitby, the Colonel's old army friend. Her face was lined with years of hardship, but her eyes burned with a cold, steady anger. "You always were too clever, us Jane Marple," she said, her voice low and controlled. "I thought the glove and the perfume would send everyone chasing after the two women. A jealous wife and a scheming girl, perfect scapegoats. Miss Marple regarded her with quiet compassion. You killed Sylvia Lane first, didn't you, Martha, in the summer house? She had discovered your long affair with the Colonel. Yes, it was an affair, not mere friendship, and threatened to tell Dolly everything unless the Colonel paid her off handsomely. You couldn't allow that. You had waited too many years, sacrificed too much. Mrs. Whitby's hands trembled slightly as she gripped the back of a chair. Edward promised me everything after his wife died, but Dolly never died. She just grew older and more difficult. When he started talking about Sylvia taking my place, giving her money, only home, I knew I had to act. Sylvia was young and greedy. She laughed at me when I confronted her. So I ended it, quickly. And the Colonel? Miss Marple asked gently. He was surprised, Mrs. Whitby said, her voice breaking for the first time. He thought I had come to accept the new arrangement. I leaned close, as I had done so many times before, and fired. He never expected it from me. Then I arranged the rest. The glove at the vicarage to start the gossip. The coat in the lake. The perfume poured everywhere. I even persuaded poor Dolly to help me move Sylvia's things. Told her it was to protect the Colonel's reputation. She was so broken by then she barely questioned it. Tears filled Dolly Bantry's eyes. No, wait. It was not Dolly. Mrs. Whitby continued, but her confession revealed the final piece. Dolly saw too much afterward, so she realized what I had done. I couldn't let her live with that knowledge. I took her to the ice house behind the stables. It's been locked for years, but I knew the old key. She's there, alive, I swear it. I only wanted time to get away. A collective gasp went through the room. Inspector Slack immediately sent constables running toward the old ice house with tools to break the lock. Miss Marple stepped closer to Mrs. Whitby, her voice filled with genuine sorrow. You planned it all so carefully, Martha. The knock at 7:30 was you, wearing Sylvia's glove, carrying her perfume. You left, hoping the village would believe both women had vanished together. But small things betrayed you. The button in the rose garden, the timing of the telephone call, the perfume on the collar from an intimate gesture you had shared many times before. And then most of all, the human heart. Dolly could never have staged such a cold departure. Her love, even wounded, was too real. Mrs. Whitby sank into a chair, suddenly looking old and defeated. I loved him for 30 years, in secret, through his marriage, through his pride. And in the end, he chose a silly girl over me. I couldn't bear it. Dr. Haydock moved to her side, his medical bag ready. The human cost was clear on every face. Jealousy that had festered into murder, loyalty twisted into betrayal, and a lifetime of hidden pain finally exposed. Within minutes, shouts came from the garden. The constables had opened the ice house. Dolly Bantry was brought out, weak, cold, and dazed, but alive. She had been bound and gagged, terrified but unharmed. When she saw Miss Marple, tears streamed down her face. Ah, Jane, I thought I would never see any of you again. She said it was for the best, that Edward would have wanted it. Miss Marple embraced her old friend with real warmth and relief. You are safe now, my dear. That is what matters. The rest will heal in time. Later that afternoon, as the police took Mrs. Whitby away, the little group sat together in the drawing room. Dolly, wrapped in blankets with hot tea in her hands, looked at Miss Marple with exhausted gratitude. How did you know, Jane? How did you see through it all? Miss Marple smiled gently, though her eyes were moist. Because I have lived long enough to know that the loudest stories are often the ones meant to distract us. The quiet ones, the small inconsistencies born of real human feelings, are what tell the truth. A glove left too deliberately, perfume used too strongly, a wife who loved her roses even in despair, and a woman who had waited too long for a promise that was never kept. Griselda wiped her eyes and hugged Leonard tightly. It's over, but it hurts so much, all that wasted love and pain. Yes, my dear, Miss Marple said softly. Murder always hurts the living most, but truth, even when painful, allows healing to begin. Colonel Bantry made mistakes, as we all do. Sylvia was young and foolish. Martha Whitby let bitterness consume her. And Dolly, you survived with your kind heart intact. Dolly reached out and squeezed Miss Marple's hand. Thank you for not giving up on me, for seeing the real story behind the one someone tried to write. As evening fell, Miss Marple walked slowly home through the village, and the church clock struck 7:30 once more, exactly 4 days since that quiet knock had echoed through the vicarage door. She paused for a moment, listening to the chimes, and whispered to the gathering dusk. Someone left that evening. But the most important thing is that someone has come back, and the village can begin to mend. In her cottage, she set the grey glove and pearl button aside, no longer needed as clues. They would serve now as quiet reminders of how fragile human happiness can be, and how carefully one must listen to the small, unspoken things. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small, kind smile touched with sadness and wisdom. Life goes on, she murmured, with all its joys and sorrows, and one does what one can to help the truth find its way. Outside, the lights of St. Mary Mead began to glow warmly in the windows. The mystery was solved. The human hearts, though bruised, would heal in time. And that, Miss Marple reflected as she settled by her fire with her knitting, was perhaps the greatest mercy of all. Epilogue. A week later, soft autumn sunlight filtered through the windows of the vicarage drawing-room. Miss Marple sat knitting peacefully, while Dolly Bantry poured tea with slightly trembling hands. The nightmare was over, yet the quiet scars remained. Sometimes, Dolly said softly, I still smell gardenias in my dreams. Miss Marple smiled gently, her needles clicking in their familiar rhythm. Time will fade even the strongest sense, my dear. What matters is that you survived with your kind heart, unbroken. Outside, the church clock struck 7:30 once more. This time, no one left. And in St. Mary Mead, life quietly began again. Wiser, gentler, and a little more careful with love.